Okay, just a moment and we'll start the lecture today. Okay, guys, now that we're here and it's 2:30, I'm just going to get everything going for our meeting. Welcome back. Hope you guys had a great weekend and that your first week of classes was nice and everything's going smoothly so far. Feel free right now, I would say, to just leave a comment of any kind, just say hello. It's always good to see who all's present and get the chat kind of interface rolling. So yes, please let me see you guys. Hi there, everybody. Emmy, Justiano, Jimena, Juan Young, Andrea, Isaac, Brennan, Angel, Alexander, Alan, Ashley, Dustin, Madison, Karen, Kiwi, Steve, Jeet, Gabby, Danny, Uriel, Grace, Anthony. Thank you guys so much. I do appreciate seeing you guys here and your continued attendance and attention to the class. So here's the plan today. We have another straightforward lecture on the philosophy of religion. We're going to continue to develop these notes on the ontological argument today. We'll talk a little bit more about some objections and replies to the original argument, what some have found faulty about the argument and why they don't necessarily agree that it proves its case. So the first thing I guess I'll do is review some of the information from last lecture, go over the argument again, make sure that that is clear, and then we'll press forward with the notes on the critics for today. Have some of you guys been able to follow my announcements? Hopefully so. Like, did you notice the video recording of the lecture that I posted from Wednesday over the weekend? Anybody can tell me if that came through and you're able to see it in the announcements? Okay, good. Yeah, obviously the class is face-to-face for the most part, but during these first 2 weeks while we have these virtual meetings, I have a separate YouTube channel that is running at the same time as this Zoom feed. And so I just kind of use it to capture the lecture, and any important notes I just kind of paste into it. So that's there for your convenience, for your notes and review at any time. Okay, then, so let's go back over our ontological argument and kind of just situate ourselves again on this argument and then go for the objections. So first of all, as you guys know, the first topic in our class is the philosophy of religion, where we consider different arguments trying to prove that God exists, objections to those arguments, discussions of the concept of God or the rationality of religious belief. So there are a host of very important arguments on this topic, and the first one that we've all studied is the ontological argument, which was written originally by St. Anselm in the year 1077 when he wrote his book, The Proslogion. So let me see from you guys, before I go ahead and just give a very detailed recap of the argument, anybody can tell me if they remember some points about how the argument goes. Like, how does this man, Anselm, try to prove that God exists? What is his first move, or what are some of his claims that begin the argument? Let me just hear that from anybody here, whether it's in the chat, in the mic, or whatever you'd like. And then I'll kind of expand on your commentary. I just kind of want to see from you. Okay, so Andrea, you say how God is part from both mind and reality. Okay, good. There's some correct information in there. I'm a little confused about the use of the term part, but I think I know in general what you mean. So the argument tries to show that God exists in both the mind and in reality. That's right. How does he try to show that God has to exist in the mind and in reality? Because some people might think that God only exists in the mind by itself and it's not something real, like, you know, fictional things or like storybook creatures. So what's the first thing he says? That's correct, but taking a few steps behind that, he starts us off by claiming, correct, Ashley, that God is thought of as the greatest conceivable being. Yes, and also correct, Mary. So to be the greatest conceivable being, he thinks that has certain implications, meaning that it logically entails certain facts about this being. So he says everybody's mind has this idea of God. The idea of God is the idea of the greatest conceivable being, or sometimes he says the being than which none greater can be conceived. He believes that everyone has this general idea of God in their mind, and as we discussed it on Wednesday last week, we talked about what are some of the classical attributes that are usually associated with God. For example, that he's thought to be all-powerful, meaning omnipotent, or that he's thought to be omniscient, which means all-knowing, or all good, meaning omnibenevolent, present at all times and places, omnipresent. And so once we consider God and the kind of being he's thought to be, the general notion sort of appears to the mind that he's the greatest conceivable being. Now, Andrea, you added another comment. You say how God is the greatest conceivable being, and if he did not exist in the mind and in reality, then that means that he has flaws and he's not then considered the greatest conceivable being. Yes, exactly. So what we were saying just now is that God's definition is greatest conceivable being. And according to Anselm, everybody has the same idea, whether that person is an atheist or a believer in God. Everyone seems to have at least the notion that God, by definition, is the greatest conceivable being. So the next question he raises is, could it be that this greatest conceivable being is only in the mind, or does the greatest conceivable being exist in the mind and in reality? So that pushed our discussion towards examples of things that are only in the mind versus things that are in both the mind and in reality. So like we talked about, I don't know, things that are just in the mind, like dragons, unicorns, the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, Winnie the Pooh. These are beings that don't really exist in reality. They're just in the mind. On the other hand, there are things that, of course, do exist in the mind, but they're also real, like me, like you, like this table, and then continuing from there, things that we're all familiar with that are objects in the world or in the universe, the Eiffel Tower, the, I don't know, Great Wall of China, the moon, the planet Mars. These are things that are real. They're not just in your head. They're out there in the physical world, even if nobody ever thought about them, or if you stopped having the ability to think about anything, they would still have their own objective existence. So question again is, what is God? Is it something that's only in the mind, like the former examples, or is it something that's in both, like those current examples? And as you say, Andrea, it's correct. To Anselm, once we have these two elements, that God's definition is the greatest conceivable being, and that there are some things that are only in the mind, but others that are in the mind and in reality, he says logic implies that God has to be in both. Why? Because it is greater to exist in both of them than in just one. So if, for example, God only existed in the mind, that would be like saying that God, the greatest conceivable being, is not the greatest thing that you could possibly conceive or imagine, which would be a contradiction, and therefore God has to exist in both. So simply stated, the definition of God being greatest conceivable being means that he has to exist in both because that's greater than to only exist in one. Now, there was this one or two additional points that were made after that. I don't know if any of you can remind the class about this second element of his overall argument. That's the core of it that I just talked to you about, that the definition of God plus the idea that it's greater to exist in reality and the mind, those imply that he does exist in both, short of contradiction. But what is the second point? Can anyone say it? If not, I'll remind you about it. But it's always good to see where the student's current understanding is at. So what's the secondary point of Anselm? Not only that God exists in the mind and in reality, because that's the greatest or that's greater, but also that what? He cannot even be what? He can't, you say, Brennan, not exist. Sort of, yes. But there's another word that I'm trying to fish around for here. He cannot be thought not to exist. That's right, Isaac. And please forgive the sort of tongue twister nature of this way of putting it, but that's what he says, that God cannot be thought not to exist. The reasoning behind that is, again, the same, that if a being can be thought not to exist, this presents a deficiency or something that's not as great as it could be. It's greater to be the sort of being that could never even be thought of as non-existent. And so in keeping with the definition of God, greatest conceivable being, not only must he exist in the mind and in reality too, but he cannot even be thought not to. And then, Madison, you've added the final note, which is that because of this last claim that God cannot be thought not to exist, there must not be any person who thinks God doesn't exist. So what do we say then of the atheists in the world who at least say the words, I don't think that God exists. You're right then, Madison, and also Andrea, that to those folks, they're not having the right idea of God. The concept they have in their mind corresponds to something other than God, because God himself cannot be thought not to exist. So in the words or thoughts of such people, the term God represents something other than the real thing. And that's how he says it might look like some people think there's no God, because that's what they're saying to you, but they don't even have the idea that there's no God because they're using the term in some kind of other way with a different meaning or definition. Okay, so that's my little quick recap of the more detailed lecture that we had last time. And I invite you, if you need to return to the textbook or to the recorded version of the Wednesday lecture last week to reinforce some of the basics of that argument. And last time through, I'll just do a lightning round recap here now that we've gone over it. God's defined as the greatest conceivable being to all people, whether they're believers or not. Some things are only existing in the mind, like a leprechaun. Some things exist in the mind and in reality, like the moon. Question, which sort of thing is God? Answer, has to be in both, because that's greater than only existing in the mind. And if he didn't exist in both, he would not be, as the definition says, the greatest conceivable being. Okay, secondly, he cannot even be thought not to exist, because if he could, that would also be less than great, less than maximally great. And so finally, if anybody says they don't think there's a God, this must not be the real thought they do have. Instead, they think there's no God, quote unquote, where their notion of the concept doesn't refer to the real thing. Okay, now with that in place, I'm able to start talking to you more about the objections. One of those objections we briefly touched on the Wednesday lecture last week, but I want to kind of brush up on it again, recap it, and kind of make it clear. So the first objection to the argument was written by this man, and the name is Gaunilo, spells Gaunilo. So the man named Gaunilo, not a lot is known about him. What we know from the writings and stuff that have survived is that he was a Christian monk who lived in a monastery around the same time as Anselm. And so he was aware of Anselm's writings and his argument that God exists. But even though clearly as a monk, he's a believer in God, he's not a fan of the ontological argument itself. He thinks this is not the right kind of attempt to prove God's existence, or he believes in God on a different basis, not based on this argument. So he finds fault with the argument, and that's what he's going to criticize. Now, let me read some of his words from the paper that he wrote, and then I'll expand on it. The first thing he does on page 17, Gaunilo, is he does a summary statement of the ontological argument itself. He wants to kind of make clear to his readers what argument he's going to now criticize and object to. So here's his way of summarizing it, which I think is actually very good and clear. So for anybody who ever wants like a nice precise summary of the ontological argument, you'll definitely find it on page 17 in the opening part of Gaunilo's essay. And here's what he says. Now keep in mind as I'm reading this is him summarizing his opponent's view. Sometimes I've seen students who write on this topic and they get confused into thinking that this is Gaunilo's own argument, the ontological argument. But no, he is the critic, and he simply states his opponent's position first. And this is what he says to summarize it. To one doubting whether there is or denying that there is something of such a nature than which nothing greater can be thought, it is said in the proslogion that its existence is proven, first, because the very one who denies or doubts it already has it in his mind, since when he hears it spoken of, he understands what is said. And further, because what he understands is necessarily such that it exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. And this is proven by the fact that it is greater to exist both in the mind and in reality than in the mind alone. Because if this same being exists in the mind alone, anything that existed also in reality would be greater than this being, and therefore that which is greater than everything would be less than something and would not be greater than everything, which is obviously a contradiction. So therefore it is necessarily the case that that which is greater than everything, being already proven to exist in the mind, should exist not only in the mind, but also in reality, because otherwise it would not be greater than everything. Okay, so clear enough synopsis of the argument. But the next thing he goes to do from there is to show why the argument fails in his view. And he thinks the argument fails because the same format of argument could be used to attempt to prove the existence of things that we know do not exist. So he uses Anselm's argument pattern to construct a sort of parody of the argument that shows how absurd and ridiculous it is to Gamillo. And the example that he uses, the analogy that he produces for us, is this hypothetical example of what he calls the lost island. Okay, so his chosen example in his paper is this thing he calls the lost island. Okay, so just to keep that chat box active, sorry, I'm just going to put some of the key terms in there as we go through the meeting. So, okay, yeah, lost island. Now, some of us that were in attendance last meeting might remember my brief mention of the lost island concept in Gamillo's paper. Can anybody fill us in or say a word or two about what it is or what he sort of talks about it being in his paper? What kind of island is this, the lost island, so-called? Let's hear it whenever you're ready. Oh, sorry, guys. Hey, my microphone's off. So I looked at the chat. This is why I was wondering. You guys are quiet today. I'm so sorry. I had my speaker off. Okay, so I can hear you now. Were you guys talking just a moment ago? Was that Isabella?
Yeah, I just said that it was like kind of told as the perfect island.
Okay, yes, got you. Correct. Yes, that's right. I was looking at the chat and I'm like, oh, there's all these text about perfect island, but I'm not saying it. Anyway, thank you. So you're right. It was described and defined as the perfect island, the island than which none greater could be conceived. Reductio ad absurdum, Emmy, I'll touch on that in a moment. Yes, the reductio argument strategy is used here, but I was asking separate from that what the lost island even was. And so, yes, it's called the greatest conceivable island, the perfect island, the island that's better than any other island you could imagine. Now, why does he draw our attention to this made-up example? Because what he's saying is that if you were really to agree with Anselm's conclusions in his argument, then the logic of Anselm would imply what about the lost island? That since it's defined as the greatest conceivable island, that this carries with it what consequence or implication? That it must be real. Yes, that's right, Kira. So the idea, though, that this lost island is actually real is totally absurd because we know it's a made-up thing that we just created for the sake of having a discussion about Anselm's reasoning. So any argument which concludes with the existence of the lost island must therefore be a defective argument. And since that argument is exactly parallel to the argument that Anselm himself gives towards the existence of God, this shows that there's a problematic argument here that doesn't work. Let me read you the words of Mr. Gamillo, and you can hear him say it himself. So, by the way, the title of his paper, Gamillo's paper, I know the lost island is the main concept in there, but the paper itself is called In Behalf of the Fool. I just want to make the title clear. I know you should have it, and it should be something that you've already read in the book, but to anybody who's a little behind on that or just wants to be clear, the title of Gamillo's paper from 1078, so the same year or the following year after the Proslogion was published, it's called In Behalf of the Fool. Why is it called In Behalf of the Fool? Because remember, who does Anselm say the fool is? It's the non-believer. It's the person that doesn't believe in God. When he quotes from the Psalms, the scripture says, the fool has said in his heart there's no God. So in a sort of clever turning of the tables, Gamillo kind of embraces the title of fool, and he says, I'm going to make this argument on behalf of, or like in support of, the so-called fool's viewpoint that God doesn't exist, or at least that the ontological argument doesn't really prove it. So anyway, just a word on the title, In Behalf of the Fool. And that is context for you, because now I'm going to read his quote. He says, but the fool can perhaps reply that this thing is said already to exist in the mind only in the sense that I understand what is said. For could I not say that all kinds of unreal things, not existing in themselves in any way at all are equally in the mind, since if anyone speaks about them, I understand what he says. And now he goes into the example. So he says, for example, they say that there is in the ocean somewhere an island, which because of the difficulty or impossibility of finding that which does not exist, some have called the lost island. And the story goes that it is blessed with all manner of priceless riches and delights in abundance, much more even than the Happy Isles, and having no owner or inhabitant, it is superior everywhere to all the other lands that men inhabit. So right there he says superior in all ways to other lands. This is therefore the idea of the greatest conceivable island. Continuing with the book, he says, now if anyone tells me that it is like this, I shall understand what is said, since nothing is difficult about that. But if he then goes on to say, as though it was just logical, that you cannot anymore doubt that the island that is more excellent than all other lands truly exists somewhere in reality, then you can doubt that it is in your mind. And since it is more excellent to exist not only in the mind, but also in reality, therefore it must be that it exists, because if it didn't, any other land existing in reality would be better than it, and this land already conceived to be more excellent than others would not be more excellent. If someone tried this way to persuade me that the island really exists beyond all doubt, I would either think that he was joking, or I would find it hard to decide which of us I should think is the bigger fool. Me, if I agree with him, or he, if he thinks that he is proving the existence of the island in any way with certainty. So there you have it. That's the reply of the fool to Anselm's argument. Do you see the general idea here? He says, if Anselm's argument is really to be believed, then I will show you another example of how the same logic would lead us to conclude that this made-up lost island actually exists. And since that is so ridiculous and absurd, we must therefore find fault with the argument, because the argument for God's existence that Anselm gives is exactly on a par and parallel to the argument that Gaunilo gives towards the existence of the so-called lost island. So he thinks the two arguments have equal strength and validity. Therefore, if you find this argument to be ridiculous, the one about the island, then you should have the same reaction when it's being used to try and show the existence of God. So from Gaunilo's viewpoint, oh, and not to worry, just I got one direct message from a student that lost Wi-Fi connection, but you're back now, and I'll post the full lecture later too, so you'll be able to recover the lost notes, but I'm glad that you're back. So yes, as I was just saying, Gaunilo's claim is that you cannot prove God exists just by saying he's defined as the greatest conceivable being. Because if you could really do that, then I could just say to you that there's an idea in my mind right now and in your mind of like the greatest conceivable movie. And therefore this movie must exist, because if it didn't really exist, that would detract from its greatness. Or that there's a greatest conceivable hamburger, or song, or pair of shoes. Anyway, we all know that these are just made up ideas, and just defining something by a definition alone as the greatest conceivable fill in the blank, whatever, that by itself can't show the thing actually exists. Okay, so an attempt to prove the reality of something just by starting off with an idea of it is not enough. We cannot build a bridge from the concept of something towards it really existing, even if the concept is something defined as the greatest conceivable being. Now, sometimes I've seen students who write on this topic, and one detail that sometimes people misunderstand is they say like, well, it's not that everything in the mind has to exist, because we have all kinds of movies where there's like, the X-Men, Wolverine and all that, and they don't exist. Well, that's correct, yes, but there's one slight difference between that example and the examples of Anselm and Gaunilo. In Anselm and Gaunilo's case, the thing is defined as the greatest conceivable whatever. And so the point to take away from Gaunilo is that even when something's defined as the greatest conceivable blank in the mind, that concept cannot establish its real existence in reality. So it's a little more nuanced than just not everything in your mind exists in reality, like Santa Claus doesn't really exist. It's more so that when you define something in your head as the greatest conceivable being, that is not enough proof that it really does exist in the real world. If it did serve to prove this, then we would have a proof of all kinds of absurd things that we just sure don't exist. Okay, now let me make one point in reference to the concept of reductio ad absurdum, since a student has mentioned it previously in our lecture today. Both Anselm and his opponent, Gaunilo, use this topic or this concept of argument called reductio ad absurdum. And what that means in Latin is to reduce to absurdity. The way that argument pattern works is you want to prove some claim, and in order to prove it, you start by assuming the exact opposite of what you're trying to prove. Now, you assume this opposite thing only to show that if it was really true, it would lead to something impossible or absurd or contradictory. And once you've shown that, that actually proves your original intended claim. So, as I said last week, if I wanted to show somebody that the planet Earth is not flat, I would say to them, well, let's assume that it's flat. Let me go ahead and assume your opposing view. If this were the case, then it would imply that objects would fall off the edge of the Earth. It would imply that all existing photos of the Earth from space are somehow forged. It would also imply that there should not be different time zones depending on where you're standing on the surface of this flat disk. So since those are absurd implications, we can therefore rule out that assumption that it's not flat. And in other words, so that it is flat, that it's not round. And therefore, we've concluded that the planet Earth is not flat. So one last time, if that confused you in any way, I want to be precise. I seek to prove it's not flat. Assuming it is, we then get absurd consequences. This thus proves that it is not flat. And in the case of Anselm and Gaunilo, Anselm says God is defined as the greatest conceivable being. And his next attempt is to prove that he does not only exist in the mind by itself. So he assumes for the moment that God does exist only in the mind. But this is supposed to imply the contradiction that God is then not the greatest conceivable being. So therefore, he does not only exist in the mind, but in the mind and in reality. And with Gaunilo, what he's showing us is that Anselm's argument doesn't work. So he assumes for the moment that Anselm's argument can prove what it seeks to prove. But if it could, contrary to what he's wanting to prove, then in that case, the lost island would be real. But we know that that's a fictional and made-up idea. So on the assumption of Anselm's argument working, we get an absurd result, the existence of a lost island too. And therefore, we can safely conclude that the argument does not work. Okay, so that's just a whole bunch of information about the ontological argument to recap, and then the first big objection to it. But there's more to say today, because today's real focus is to go beyond that material and to talk about two other critics of the ontological argument and what they found problematic about it. So that's our goal now, and I'll clear the board so we can start adding some new notes on another opponent of the ontological argument. And this is going to be the author G.E. Moore, and his paper is called Is Existence a Predicate? Is Existence a Predicate by G.E. Moore? And this paper comes to us from the year 1936. G.E. Moore is a British philosopher who lived in the 19th and 20th century. He lived from 1873 until 1958, just so you know the dates of his life. And it's interesting to see that this man, G.E. Moore, writing in the just recently past 20th century, is still interested in the topic of the ontological argument, because we're fast forwarding 1,000 years in time, right? The ontological argument was written by Anselm in 1077 AD. And now 900 years later, we still have people that are interested enough in the topic to try and form newfound criticisms of it. It gives you a kind of sense of the durability of these topics and problems and how the arguments live on to the next generation. But okay, so G.E. Moore, Is Existence a Predicate, from 1936. So let me clarify one point in his title here. The word predicate is being used, and maybe not everybody is clear on what a predicate is. So let me give you the information on this. Predicate. So the word predicate is just a sort of word that's used in logic and grammar to refer to an attribute of a thing. So it is a feature, attribute, or quality of something. So what I wrote here is predicate, an attribute, feature, or quality of something. And in language and in grammar, we say that every sentence that is a complete sentence has a subject-predicate structure. And that's true. With every given sentence that has that form, it's a complete sentence. There's a subject, something that is the main object being talked about in the statement, and then there's some predicate that's attributed to the subject. So let me help you with that and talk about some examples. If I say to you guys that the dog is brown, can anybody guess or say what would be the subject of that sentence? The sentence, again, is just that the dog is brown. So not too hard. What do you guess or judge to be the subject of that sentence? It is the dog. Very good. Correct. Yeah, the dog is the thing being talked about in a sentence. Now, if I say to you that there's a predicate in the same sentence, what do you think the predicate would be? The dog is brown. Good. Correct, Isaac. Brown and all the rest of you guys. Brown is the attribute or the quality that I'm predicating, as they say, of the subject. So that's, in that example, a subject-predicate combination. Dog, subject, predicate being brown. If I tell you that the sun is hot, that's just another randomly chosen example. The sun would be the subject of that sentence, and being hot, the quality of being hot, would be the predicate, the attribute that is associated with that thing. Okay, so now that we know what predicate is, the question of the title becomes clearer. The title of the paper is this: is existence a predicate? Meaning, is existence an attribute or a quality of something? Is existence something that we would describe as a feature of something? Yes or no? And to sort of anticipate his ultimate conclusion in this paper, what G.E. Moore is going to result in at the end, he's going to conclude that existence is not a predicate. It's not a predicate. And if it's not a predicate, if it's not an attribute of a thing, then that, he believes, destroys the ontological argument, because in the judgment of this man, in this author's view, the ontological argument is crucially based on the idea that existence is somehow a predicate. And let me try to give you the reasoning behind that. Anselm, the author of the ontological argument, he says that God is the greatest conceivable being by definition. And from there, it's just a few steps, he thinks, to prove that he's real, because he says, if you're defined as the greatest conceivable being, you would have to have all the best features to sort of meet that standard of being greatest. You'd have to have all the best qualities. But if you didn't actually exist, if you didn't have that quality, then you'd be missing one attribute that's necessary to be the greatest conceivable being. So it's like it enhances how great something is when it has the feature of existence, as opposed to not having it. And so in the argument of Anselm, existence is treated like it's a property of something, like it's an attribute of something. An attribute, the lacking of which would make something less great than it could conceivably be. But now G.E. Moore enters the scene 900 years later, and he's like, hold on a minute, though. That's wrong. Existence is not an attribute in the first place. And if it's not an attribute, if it's not a predicate, in his words, then it won't serve the purposes of Anselm's argument in the way that he needs. Okay, so the whole goal now by Mr. Moore is to try and show and prove to his readers, all of us, that contrary to Anselm's assertion, existence is not a predicate. It's not an attribute of something. Okay, so that's where we're headed in discussing Moore's work here. Now, I'm going to talk to you about the sort of specific examples that G.E. Moore chooses to go with in his paper, and some of them are a little weird, and you could argue a little technical. But before I dive into those pages of his, I want to make the point to you in a more kind of conversational, everyday way. Okay, so let me try and put it in a slightly different way so it comes clear, and then we'll talk about Moore's examples. To see that existence is not a predicate, that it's not an attribute, you know, you can just think from a level of common sense as to how you would never really describe something with the usage of the word exists. Attributes of things are listed when we try to describe what something is like or what kind of thing it is. So let me give you an example of a scenario where someone might realistically give a description of something. Say that you were trying to sell a car on the marketplace. So in order to sell it, you obviously have to generate interest in the car, and therefore you have to tell people what it's like. That means that you'll tell them attributes that it has, like its make, its model, what amenities or features the car may have, okay? But wouldn't this be like a bizarre looking advertisement? You're looking for a car, and here's the attached description. It says car, 2012 Honda Civic, 30,000 miles, power locks and windows, it's blue, it exists, it has a sunroof. Okay, now one of those things is not like the others, right? It kind of stands apart from a normal way of describing something. And I'm hoping that you kind of caught the vibe there, that it's to say that it exists in mentioning its description. Normally, we take it as a given that if something is being described, the thing exists, of course, because things that don't exist don't have descriptions because they're just non-existent. Like if I told you about my brother Danny and I said, oh yeah, he's an avid runner. He got his degree in kinesiology. He lives in Central California. He's 5'11". He exists. He also, he loves seafood and blah, blah, blah. Again, mentioning existence in the general list of descriptive factors stands alone and seems to not really ring true to how you describe things. So that's me just trying to make the point to you in a common sense way that something seems weird or funny or uncommon about using existence in any attempt to describe something. So from that alone, you can kind of get the point that Moore is trying to make. But for better or worse, we actually have to engage with his own way of putting it. And that means that we'll have to take some attention to his examples. So let's do that now. So G.E. Moore, he gives one main example to sort of press his case here that existence is not, after all, an attribute of anything. And the example he gives is sort of a linguistic comparison between two different sets of sentences. One set of sentences which has a genuine attribute, predicate, in it, and then another set of sentences which is parallel to the first, except we replace the predicate with the word exists. And what Moore believes is that this will show us how the sentences don't make sense any longer once we try to use existence in the position of a predicate. This logical misbehavior of the statement, once existence is used as a predicate, indicates to us that it's not a predicate. Okay, so the sentences that are used by the author involve the words tigers growl. Okay, so let's consider the statement tigers growl. Now, as I said before, every proper sentence in language has a subject and a predicate. So in this case, tigers growl. Tiger is the subject, and growling, the attribute of growling, is the predicate that's associated with tigers. Now, G.E. Moore says, looking at this sentence here, there's three possible interpretations that one could have of it. And those three interpretations of the sentence depend on what kind of prefix we attach to it, either all, most, or some. Okay, so tigers growl could be interpreted to mean that all tigers growl. Maybe that is what the person claims when they say this. Another possibility is that they mean most tigers growl. Not all of them, but just most. And the third possible case is to just say that some tigers growl is what is implied by the statement. So we have these three prefixes associated with the statement tigers growl: all, most, and some. And these three statements, they all say something slightly different about the quantity of tigers who do growl. This says that it's 100% of them. The second sentence says that, well, let me ask you, for most tigers growl to be true, how many of the tigers would have to growl? I know you can't say a number because that's not given here, but it would just have to be more than 50%, right, Isaac? Because if it was less than 50%, it wouldn't be most. So most means the majority. So in this case, we're saying out of all the tigers, more of them growl and fewer of them don't. And some tigers growl, that implies something even less committed. It just means not that even all or most, but at least one tiger growls. Because if there's even one growling tiger, then this is true that some, at least, tigers growl. Okay, so here's the takeaway from this kind of strange example he's giving. The takeaway is simply that all three of these sentences where growl is in there, they make sense. They just have a reasonable meaning that is clear enough to understand. Nobody would sort of like scratch their head and say, I have no idea what you're saying. If you looked at them and you said, yeah, most tigers growl, they'd be like, sure, that makes sense. And the same with the others. All tigers growl, some tigers growl. Anybody who hears those statements would not find them confusing, hard to understand, or difficult to interpret. But the situation changes, says the author, when we replace the word growl, which is a predicate, with the word exists. Okay, so now we get these three statements when we do that substitution. It's just the same three sentences with the word exist at the end. Okay, so now we have created these three sentences by replacing the predicate growl with the word exist. We've got all tigers exist, most tigers exist, and some tigers exist. Now, the point that Moore makes here is this. With these three statements, with exists placed inside, the statements do not all make sense anymore. They all made fine, perfectly clear sense when growls was being used. But now that we have swapped it out for the word exists, two of these three statements make no sense at all. The one and only one of the three here that does make some sense, he says, is some tigers exist. But the other two have no clear meaning. And let me try and go into that. So let's talk about most tigers exist, the sentence there, the second one. What did we say before? Isaac, you know this, and some others that were listening, that when we said most tigers growl, that would easily be interpreted to mean that more than 50% of the tigers growl, and then the smaller quantity do not. But in saying that most tigers exist, this would imply that the majority of tigers exist, and then the minority of them do not. But this makes no sense, because there's no way to compare the size or quantity of a group of things on the one hand which exist, and on the other hand which don't exist. Did I hear a microphone? Sorry, thought I did, but it's okay if it was just...
That was my bad. I'm sorry. I just accidentally unmuted myself.
Oh yeah, you're all good. You're all good. Just making sure I didn't pass a question up. So I was mentioning most tigers exist, right? And all I was trying to say here is that that sentence doesn't have any kind of clear, understandable meaning. Because if you really dive into it and try to make it make sense, it seems to say that there's more tigers that exist and fewer of them that don't. But there's no way to give the amount or number of things that don't exist. So we're talking nonsense. We're talking gibberish, really, if we say most tigers exist. That would be like saying, okay, out of 100 tigers, 60 of them exist and 40 of them what? Don't? We cannot say how many things don't exist. Look around the room you're in right now. Tell me, how many non-existent tigers are there in the room? You should have the reaction that this is a ridiculous and absurd question, because there's no way to count things that what? That don't exist. So if I say to you there's 100, 1,000,000, 1, 10 non-existent objects in your vicinity, the claim has no way to be evaluated, and there's no truth value to it. So most tigers exist doesn't have the clear and easy meaning that most tigers growl does. When you're using a real predicate and you say a majority of the things in a certain case have that feature, you're dividing the class of objects into those that have the predicate and then those that don't. Say that those that are watching this meeting right now, all of you students, if I say to you guys that most of you are not wearing glasses, that would make perfectly good sense if we took the number of students watching and we saw that the number who are wearing glasses was smaller than those that are. But in the case of those that are not wearing the glasses, they're still existing beings, right? They're beings that exist and they just don't have a certain feature. When we use existence itself as the so-called attribute, there's no way to talk about the things that don't have it, because something that lacks existence is not just an object that fails to have a certain property, like a person who does not have long hair or does not have glasses. A being that does not exist is not a being at all. And so we're led to absurd and meaningless statements when we try to replace the predicate with the word exists. The same would be true of all tigers exist. Okay, so let me go over that one. all tigers growl is equivalent to saying that each tiger growls and there is no tiger that does not growl. But if we replaced exists and tried to give the same analysis, we would say all tigers exist means that each tiger exists and there is no tiger that does not exist. But for that to have any kind of understanding behind it, we would have to have some notion of what the non-existent tiger is. To say that there is no tiger that does not exist cannot be analyzed unless we know what it is for there to be a non-existent tiger. And once again, talking about a non-existent object is a contradiction in terms. A non-existent tiger is not anything. It's something that doesn't exist. The same kind of point could be seen with the negative form of these expressions. So suppose that I offered you this additional example here. Some tigers do not growl. That sentence, the negation of the predicate, saying that some of them don't have it, is perfectly clear. Some tigers do not growl means that there's at least one tiger in the world that doesn't have that feature. But if we replace growl once again with exists, we have another bizarre sentence. Some tigers do not exist. This doesn't make sense because it's saying that there are some things that are not things. There are some things that have no existence is a contradiction in terms. So let me kind of bring this all home for you a little bit. G. Moore is out to show us that existence is not a predicate, and here's his method of trying to show the point. He says if you take real predicates and you see the sentences that they're involved with, like take the example of growls when it's attached to the word tiger, no matter which way you try and spin the statement, it makes sense. All, most, some do not, growl makes sense. But when we take that word growl and we swap it with the word exist, we now have a set of sentences, not all of which make sense. And actually, they all don't make sense except for the one notable exception of some tigers exist. On that point, this one makes sense because it doesn't require a comparison between the things that have the quality and that don't. Saying some tigers exist just means there's some that at least have the feature of positively existing. In all the other cases, though, we're required to engage in some type of logical comparative between the class that has the feature and those that don't. And that's where we get into the logical absurdity. So if existence transforms a sentence that it is a part of from something meaningful to something meaningless, that shows he thinks that it's not a real predicate. Any other genuine predicate that we had swapped out with growls would not have created this problem. Suppose that the predicate used was hungry. You know, all tigers are hungry, most are hungry, some tigers are hungry, some tigers are not hungry. Once again, they all make sense. They're saying slightly different things, but none of them produces that reaction of like, huh, I don't understand you. But if you told somebody most tigers exist, it would be fair for them to say, I'm sorry, but I don't quite follow your meaning. What do you mean when you say that? So it's the logical misbehavior of the newly generated statements that take exists in place of a predicate. That's what he says shows that it's not a true predicate. Now, let me read a little bit from him, and you'll hear him put it in his own interesting and kind of strange way. He says on page 20, okay, yeah, I'll follow from 19 and then continue on to 20. The sentence tigers growl seems to me to be ambiguous. As far as I can see, it might mean all tigers growl, it might mean most tigers growl, or it might mean merely that some do. Each of these three sentences has a clear meaning, and the meaning of each is different from that of the others. Now, following down a little bit, he says, but similarly, I think it is clear that tigers exist means something, which couldn't be true unless some tigers exist. But I don't think there is the same ambiguity in tigers exist that corresponds to tigers growl. So far as I can see, tigers exist and some tigers exist are merely two different ways of saying the same proposition, and it always just means that some tigers exist and nothing else whatsoever. I hope it will strike everyone that there's something strange about the statement all tigers exist or most tigers exist. It seems to imply that all tigers exist and most tigers exist have a clear meaning, just as all growl and most growl. Going down a little bit. But he says, have all tigers exist and most tigers exist any meaning at all? Certainly they don't have a clear meaning, as have all tigers growl and most tigers growl. They are puzzling expressions, which certainly do not carry their meaning, if they have any, on the face of them. That this is so indicates that there is some important difference between the usage of exist, with which we are concerned, and the usage of such words as growl or scratch. All right, so when we use the word exist in place of where a predicate otherwise would have been, especially in the statements that include the variation all, most, or some do not, we see the new sentence with the word exists fails to have any clear kind of meaning. And this logical exercise in comparing the two sets of sentences and how clear they are in their meaning is the way that Moore tries to show his readers that existence is not a predicate. And so then, like, in the bigger picture, connecting back to the ontological argument, let me just try to remind you the steps that led us here. Anselm says that God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, which means he must exist in the mind and in reality. And this implies that he thinks of existence as a predicate, an attribute, the having of which is greater than lacking it. Now Moore, 900 years later, is like, but hold up, that's not really quite correct, because if you think about it, you'll see that existence doesn't really play the role of a predicate logically. And he thinks this can be demonstrated when we compare two sentences side by side, one of which has the word growl, for example, in it as a predicate, and the other of which just swaps that out for exists. So if you found it weird and strange sounding when I said these sentences like most tigers exist, all tigers exist, in a way that's good. That kind of means you're getting it, because the whole point of the author is these are supposed to strike us as totally strange, perplexing, and hard to understand. I'm going to put one little asterisk next to the one that says some do exist, because the author is careful to mention that that's the only one that does not seem to lead to these logical absurdities and meaningless interpretations, but all the others do. Now, there's one last point on the G.E. Moore article before I wrap it up and we can start talking about the next author in the series here. He says, some people might argue that we could have some kind of understanding of these exists sentences if we think of existence and non-existence in a certain way. So some people might argue that when we talk about the tiger that doesn't exist, what we're talking about are tigers from like the world of fiction and fantasy. So a non-existent tiger would be like an imaginary tiger or like a storybook tiger that's not real. Have been a few of those, okay? So a couple come to my own mind. Somebody's ever heard of Winnie the Pooh, and Tigger was like his, one of his friends in the whatever Enchanted Woods, and he's a non-existent tiger. That's like a cartoon character tiger. There's the comic strip series Calvin and Hobbes. Anybody ever seen or heard of that? I don't know, but if you have, which one is it? Is it Hobbes or Calvin? But one of the two is a tiger that is a friend of the other character.
Hobbes.
Hobbes is the tiger. Okay, there you go. There's also Tony the tiger from Frosted Flakes. I don't know if you guys are up on your cereal mascots, but that's yet another case. So at the end of his essay, he says, somebody might tell me that when we say like most tigers exist, this actually does make sense, because it means like most tigers are flesh and blood, like animals out in the wild. But then there's a smaller number, a minority, that are like fictional beings from stories and such. And what Moore says to that response is fair enough. That could be a way of like restoring some meaning to these other sentences. Like some tigers don't exist would mean like some tigers are like Tigger or Hobbes. But in reaction to that, he says, well, if that's the only way you can bend over backwards, so to speak, to attach some type of more clear meaning to these statements, it doesn't require anything as odd as that to have a straightforward understanding of a sentence like tigers growl, or some tigers don't growl. When a predicate like growl is being involved, we don't have to kind of veer off into the strange world of fictional objects or imaginary objects. So either these sentences with exists make no sense, or they only have some kind of sensible meaning according to a very non-standard interpretation of them, involving, again, the mention of like fantasy and fiction and imaginary objects. But no mention of fictional objects is required to say like some tigers don't growl. So he sort of then returns to his main conclusion, which is that existence is not a predicate, because when it's used as a predicate, it generates sentences that are either totally meaningless or, if you want to really stretch, only meaningful according to a very strange interpretation of the statement involving fictional objects. Yeah, and so I get a question in the direct messages here about, would this present point that I'm making to you relate to most tigers exist? And yes, it would. Most tigers exist on this suggested analysis would be like saying most tigers are real physical objects, and then some of them are just storybook creatures like Tony the Tiger from Frosted Flakes. But the author Moore doesn't really find that to be a very appealing alternative. He says this still does not show that existence leads us to sentences that have any kind of clear understanding behind them. They're either totally meaningless or they require reference to fictional objects, which is still very strange. Let me read his words and you can hear him say it. So he says, the meaning which such expressions as some tigers don't exist sometimes has is that which it has when it is used to mean the same as some tigers are imaginary or some tigers are not real. That some tigers are imaginary may really express a proposition, whether true or false. I don't think that can be denied. If, for example, two different stories have been written, each of which is about a different imaginary tiger, then it would follow that there are at least two imaginary tigers, and it cannot be denied that the sentence, two different tigers occur in fiction, is meaningful, though I have not the least idea whether it's true or false. So he says, if it should happen that at the present moment two different people are each having a hallucination of a different tiger, it would follow that there are at the present moment two different imaginary tigers, and the statement that two hallucinations are happening does have a significant meaning. So the sentence, there are some tigers which don't exist, has a meaning if it means only that there are some imaginary tigers in either of these ways that he is trying to point out. But what it means is that either some real people have written stories about tigers that are imaginary, or are having or have recently had hallucinations or dreams of tigers. If nothing of this sort has happened or is happening, then there are no imaginary tigers. But if some tigers don't exist means all this, isn't it clear that exist does not in this sentence have the same comparatively straightforward and simple meaning that it has in some tigers do exist? Is it not clear that some tigers don't exist if it means all this is not related to some tigers exist in the same simple way that some tigers don't growl is related to some tigers do growl? All right, so that's his final word there. And I'll just summarize the whole point again one last time. So going back to the original argument by Anselm, keep in mind, this is a guy trying to prove the existence of God. It's a difficult task. And what he thinks he can do to prove it is just point out the definition of God that is already widely accepted, and then this other claim that it's greater to really exist in the mind and in reality than to be only relegated to the realm of the mind. Now, G. Moore finds fault with that argument because he says, in the argument, existence is being utilized as though it's an attribute of something, which, if the thing has that attribute, it stands to be greater than if it didn't have it. But Moore finds fault with the basic premise itself that existence even is an attribute, or in his usage, predicate of anything. To show it's not a predicate, we are then treated to two sets of sentences. On the one side, a group of sentences which involve the word growls in association with tigers. And the different examples given were all, most, some, and some do not. And just the takeaway there is that they're all clear enough. They all make sense. But when we take existence and put it where growls would have been, now all of them, with the exception of some exist, do not make sense. Or if they make any kind of sense, then they can only be sensible if we assume we're talking about imaginary beings or fictional creatures. No such requirement is needed to talk about the meaning of ordinary sentences where predicates are used. And so existence thus shows in this example not to be a predicate. And therefore, if it's not a predicate, it makes no sense to say the perfect being would have to have this predicate. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next author, and we just have about 15 minutes to talk about it. But that should be enough to at least set most of it up. And if there's any leftover notes on it, then as we've done before, I'll just roll that into the beginning of the next meeting. At the beginning of each meeting, as I've done today, I always like to sort of remind us of the main ideas from the previous lecture so that we have like continuity that carries us through. So I'll always try to be helpful to you guys as we go through this course, bringing you along into these heady discussions and sometimes technical and detailed writings. I also want to point one other thing out about the style of writing in philosophy. A lot of times philosophers will utilize what we call thought experiments. I often refer to them to my students as simply hypothetical scenarios. And those are important because they help us to frame certain steps within an argument and to present the pieces of an argument. I know, though, that a lot of times when people think about hypotheticals, they can sometimes become frustrated because they're so far removed from realistic things. So if an author says to you, imagine, a perfect island greater than all others you could imagine, it's already kind of strange to do that. But the point is simply to establish a premise in an argument. And so that's a quite common feature of philosophy that we'll have to kind of get used to as the semester goes on. Being told, imagine this, and then you're told to imagine something that's quite fantastic or detached from reality. But the point is not that it be realistic. The point is simply that it allows us to consider a concept as we build out an argument. So another way of seeing that was in the just recent article we discussed here when I say, okay, think of these examples of sentences, tigers exist versus tigers growl. There's just a lot of weird hypotheticals throughout philosophy. But they're also utilized in law sometimes because we have to present to the mind a case to consider so that we can then develop arguments. And so that's just a tool of logic and reasoning that's quite used. Okay, well, I say to you there's one more critic of the ontological argument that we will now learn about. And it's another modern day philosopher. His name is William Rowe. Okay, William Rowe. I'm just adding to the other record of the chat some of the other names. So we also had G.E. Moore. And his topic was his existence a predicate. Sorry, just a second. Okay. Oops. So just changing the chat interface to everybody. Thanks, guys. Okay, so we just talked about G.E. Moore's existence of predicate. Now, a new author named William Rowe, and his paper is called "Why the Ontological Argument Fails." Okay. G.E. Moore and why the ontological argument fails. Sorry here. Yeah, so about G.E. Moore, some information on him as background. He's still living. He's a recently retired professor of philosophy at Purdue University, retired in 2005. And he's an atheist. So as you guys know, the definition of atheist is somebody that does not believe that God exists. And so he doesn't believe. And that, of course, implies that he's not been convinced by any of these famous arguments that God exists. But in this paper, he really wants to call attention to the ontological argument and point out what he finds to be faulty with it and why he thinks it fails. So again, the paper is called "Why the Ontological Argument Fails." So Why the Ontological Argument Fails by American philosopher William Rowe. And this is actually from 1993, the paper when it was first published. Okay. Taking my notes a little bit here. Okay, yeah. So he starts his paper with the basic claim that you can't prove that something exists just by having an idea of it, even if the idea of the thing is the greatest conceivable being. And in more precise detail, he says you can't just define something as existing and then say, there you go, I've proven it exists because the definition says that it exists. He believes that the ontological argument by Anselm and the followers of the argument are simply defining God as an existing being and then saying that the definition is sufficient proof by itself. In a way, he thinks that the argument defines God in this sense. God is defined as, like, equals existing perfect being. So this is his restatement of what he thinks the Anselm argument is claiming. He says those that make the argument define God as existing perfect being. And then if you say to them, I don't think he exists, the proponent of the argument will just say, what do you mean? You're contradicting yourself. You're saying the existing being doesn't exist? He's defined as existing. So when you say he doesn't exist, you're going against the definition, and now you're not making any sense. But William Rowe thinks that's just not a fair way to argue. You can't prove something exists just by placing existence in the literal definition of that thing. Because if you could prove something existed that way, then I could just define into reality things that we know don't exist. So that's the overall point he's making. But once again, we got to jump into the kind of weird example that he uses to make the point. So William Rowe makes his case here by asking us to consider two made-up words. Okay, so these words are totally invented for the sake of his objection here. But it's fair because it makes a point. So he says, let's imagine that these two words here have these two definitions. So one of them I'm writing says magic can. And then the other one that I'm writing below it says magico. Okay, now these words both refer to magicians, but they're different types. The magic can is a magician that exists. So that definition is existing magician. And magico, can anybody guess? It's a contrast with magic can. So magic can is the magicians that exist. Magico, any guesses?
Is it the non-existing magician?
That's right. Yeah. So non-existing magician. Okay. And let me just put that in the chat as well, just so that it's totally clear. So just his stipulated terms, magic can, existing magician. Okay, and then magico. Non-existing magician. So notice the word magic can. It does not have the letter I after C, and that's not a typo or a spelling error because the spelling's modified to reflect that this is a specifically existing type of magician. Magico, another just made up term, but in our usage, it's going to stand for those magicians that don't exist. So let me ask you for some help on this. I'm going to erase the board. You've heard of magicians, right? People who perform magic as like their career, pull a rabbit out of a hat, card tricks, cut a lady in half, make something disappear. I don't know. So who have been some people that have really lived and breathed on this planet, and that was their job? I'm asking you for some examples of magic hands. In other words.
Houdini.
Houdini, very well known, yes, classic. Houdini, he died in the performance of a trick, even though, yeah, we'll talk about it another time. But yeah, Houdini, that's one. Anybody else? A few others? A couple other prominent names, maybe, but who else? Anybody ever watch Magic? David Blaine, thanks, Dustin. That makes sense. Yes, David Blaine. He does a lot of the like escape tricks, doesn't he? Like,
isn't there someone in like Colin Keys?
Who?
Colin Keys. I don't know.
I guess so. I'm a little not up on it, but I'll take your word for it. Am I getting the name right? Maybe. Colin Keys.
Oh yeah, there's just two L's.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's another one. David Blaine, Colin Keys. There used to be David Copperfield was another one. Penn and Teller. Yeah, they do comedy and magic kind of, but that's fair. P&T, Copperfield. Okay, just to name a few. Obviously, there's plenty of others. The list goes on, but just to get a sampling here. Now, Magico. I'm asking if anyone knows the names of fake, like fictional magicians from like fantasy and fiction. You know,
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter. Okay, that's good. Yeah, Harry Potter, not a real person, but goes to wizard school in the book series and films. And along those same lines, you've got who else? Timothy, you say masked magician. I'm not up on the reference, but if I was, I think I'd add it right away. Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange, isn't he like kind of like a mutant or something? But fine, he has powers that we might describe as magical. He's certainly not a real person. The mythical Merlin from the Knights of the Round Table, just another fictional magician. Gandalf, maybe from what is it, Lord of the Rings. There's more and more. Okay, we could keep going, but I'm not sure of the reference. Alex Russo, Isabella. Does anybody else know? It's a person that doesn't exist. I need to review some of my pop culture references, but
Alex Russo is from like Wizards of Waverly Place.
Okay, got you. Alex Russo. Okay, so AR would be another one in that case. Okay, so like here's the deal. Left side of the divider, magicians, existing magicians. Right side of the divider, magico, non-existing magicians. Now, based on the definition, okay, of magican, it's defined as a magician that does exist. But I want you to imagine a counterfactual scenario for a moment. Okay, now this is one of those thought experiments. All right, guys. We live in a world where people do magic tricks and they perform them. You could watch that tonight if you wanted on like streaming services somewhere. But imagine that stopped, or it never started to begin with. Can you imagine a counterfactual way the world could have been? So like counterfactuals are like imagining a different timeline of the world where certain things that did happen in this counterfactual scenario, they didn't happen. Like, can you imagine a world where you were never born? Sure, right? If your parents never met, I'm glad they did. But if they had never met, then you wouldn't have been able to watch this lecture right now. So in the actual world you're watching it, maybe counterfactually, you don't even exist. So can you imagine a possible world where there's no such magicians? Like there's never been anybody who's performed magic tricks and such. Let me hear you give me your answer. Is this at least imaginable?
Yeah.
Surely
right.
It is, right? I mean, come on, guys, don't be too shy. It's obviously possible. I mean, all kinds of things are possible. It's possible that no human beings ever existed, right? I mean, that could have happened differently if the world's early history had played out differently. So I want you to transport yourself to the thought of this possible world where there are no magicians. In that scenario, couldn't we still have invented the word magican? Like we could be living in a world devoid of magicians, where there are none, but somebody still invented the word magican and said that it means existing magician. That would not cause the magicians to exist unless they already otherwise did. So the word by itself is powerless to show that something exists if it didn't already factually exist. So although the word magican means existing magician, it doesn't by itself prove that they actually have to exist. Suppose for the sake of discussion that like tonight, all the magicians that do exist passed away tragically. And so tomorrow, whatever, February the 1st, is the first day where there's no more magicians. I could still be referencing this word to you in the aftermath of those events. And the word would still mean what? The word magican.
Existing.
Yes, the word magican would still mean existing magician, even if there were not any. Okay, so now, what do you think this word magican is being compared with in the overall argument of William Rowe? He's trying to say that in the ontological argument by Anselm, God, likewise, is just defined as existing. And then the argument is supposed to say, well, the definition claims existence, and so you can't say the existing being doesn't exist. But now Rowe says that simply defining a thing as existing is not enough proof. In the world we live in, there are people that play magic and so forth and that do magic tricks for their life and for their profession. But if there were no such people, the word could still carry that meaning. It's just that under those circumstances, it would not refer to anything that's real. Okay, so Magiccan is being compared to the word God by William Rowe. What's the similarity of the two terms? Both define something as existing. Both are defined as existing. Magiccan is existing magician. God, according to his analysis, means existing perfect being. But if we live in a universe where there is no God, then the word God would be like Magiccan under the circumstances where there really aren't any such beings. We could have the word, we could say that the definition of the word is existing being, but yet there wouldn't be any such thing. Okay, so in the larger scope of his criticism here, he's just trying to show that by defining something as existing, that is not proven that it's real. All it shows is that that's what the word means. But it therefore considers the ontological argument to be sort of a sophisticated form of wordplay. A word, God, is made, which says it is defined as greatest conceivable being which exists. But that definition by itself cannot prove the existence of this thing in reality. Or if it could, then I could just define something as existing and say, now we know that it's real because the word says that it's real. There's more to say about the Rowe, so I'm going to hold you in suspense. We've pretty much got through the core of it, but there's a few last points I want to say in summary and to brush up and make it a little sharper on Wednesday. So we've run out of time for today, but we got through the majority of what I wanted to say to you guys today, so I'll say last words. We're still focused on the ontological argument for the moment, and we've now heard a trio of critics, Gamillo, Moore, and Rowe. All of them find fault with it in different ways. Gamillo's problem was that the idea of the greatest conceivable whatever does not prove that it's real because the lost island can be defined as the greatest island, and we know it's not real. Moore's point was to say existence is not even an attribute in the first place, and so the whole argument is off on the wrong foot by claiming that to exist is greater than not. And he shows us that with the growl versus existence statements, tigers growl versus tigers exist. And now there's William Rowe, who says defining something as existing, that's not enough proof. I could make up the word Magiccan, which means existing magician, just like people use the word God as existing perfect being. But if there were no magicians, the word would still mean that, and there wouldn't be any such things. So in the same way, if God doesn't exist, we might have a word God, which defined as existing being, but in fact, there's no such. All right, guys. Well, that's my summary of the material for you guys today. Until next time, take it easy. I'll be sending you some links for the Wednesday meeting and the Wednesday office hours too. Of course, I have my Monday office hours, and you've got those links already if you need them. But until next time, let's break for the moment. Feel free to say goodbye and have a great day. I'll certainly see you guys in a few. And if you need anything, just feel free to email me or contact me any other way. All right, guys. See you next time, and have a good one. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.